Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Phil Blanchard. I am a partner in the Costa Mesa office of Rutan Tucker, and I would like to welcome you once again to the 7th Annual Rutan Tucker Construction Design-Build Symposium. It's our pleasure to host you this week. We're excited about the program we have for you today. I'd like to introduce our featured panelists today. We have with us Mike Marasco. Mike is the CEO of Plenary Concessions. He's been kind enough to be featured on this panel for some time, and we appreciate it very much. Plenary Concessions is a company which holds all plenary project-specific companies. Plenary Group's the market leader in the North American P3 market, having closed more than $17 billion on over 30 projects since 2005, when that business was started. Prior to joining Plenary Group, Mike was one of the founders of Partnerships Development and Delivery for Partnerships BC. In that capacity, he oversaw projects in the health, transportation, advanced education, and resource sectors. We also have with us today Rosemarie Andolino. Rosemarie is the president and CEO of Manchester Airport Group USA, which is focused on airport lounges, car parking services, and P3 retail and terminal developments. MAG is an international leader in airport developments with substantial airport operations in Great Britain and the United States. Ms. Andolino previously served as the commissioner of the Chicago Department of Aviation, overseeing O'Hare and Midway International Airports, as well as the $8 billion expansion of O'Hare's airfield. Dan Feitelberg is with us. He is the former Vice Chancellor of the Division of Planning and Budget for the University of California, Merced. After serving the University of California for 5 years, Dan joined KPMG's advisory team to help governments and higher education institutions plan and implement strategic investments. In his role as Vice Chancellor, Dan led the launch of the Merced 2020 project. That project, a $1.3 billion project, extends the first phase of campus onto a greenfield site and provides 1.2 million square feet of sustainable infrastructure, including academic, housing, and student life facilities. The university reached financial close in August of 2016. The facilities are scheduled to open 2018 with substantial completion in 2020. Bill Eliopoulos is the chair of Rutan Tucker's Infrastructure and P3 Practice Group. He is the co-chair of the Construction Law Group and the managing partner of the firm's Silicon Valley office. His experience covers virtually all types of construction projects, from large infrastructure, dams, bridges, transits, roadways, commercial, industrial, public buildings, hotels, data centers, laboratories, and just about any other healthcare, power facilities, anything else you can think of in the construction sector. His work on power facilities in particular includes drafting and negotiating contracts for development, design, and construction of solar and wind power generation plants. We also have with us Justine Kastan. Justine is a senior associate of Rutan Tucker at its Palo Alto office, where she has broad transactional and litigation experience with an emphasis on infrastructure development and P3 projects. These are our 5 panelists for today's presentation. At this time, I'd like to invite Bill and Mike and Justine on stage to give us an initial market overview in this P3 sector.
Some slides for us that give us an overview of P3.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Phil, for the introduction. So it's been a real hardship coming to this symposium every year for the last 4 or 5 years. So I'll try and tough it out again for another year. And anyways, thank you again for the invitation. When Bill talked about what we were going to speak about on the panel this year, he told me that he wanted a little update on the market. So I just threw together some slides that are based on the information data. I don't know if any of you subscribe to Infranews, but they have Infra Deals, and they got a great database of information. So there's my plug for them, even though I pay for the subscription. So I've got a bit of information for you. So just looking at sort of where we've been in the market over the last few years, from 2015 to 2017, you can see the deals that have closed, and some of those have been benchmark type deals that have resulted in other similar type transactions coming about. So as an example, the Kentucky Wired deals has put in motion a number of broadband deals now that are appearing in the marketplace using PPP as a procurement approach. Likewise, with Long Beach Civic Center, now we've seen a few, I'll call them copycat type deals, but basically hybrid real estate deals that the municipalities and cities are launching that combine both public infrastructure as well as create opportunities for real estate development to help offset the cost of the public infrastructure. We're still seeing quite a bit of activity on the civil side, and you'll see here in terms of where we are today, what types of projects are happening at different periods of time. So, and I think, if you look at it, there's 10 projects that are in a preferred proponent mode, with the majority of those being transportation and social infrastructure closely following. So that's starting to be a nice balance that we're seeing. Likewise, on the shortlisted proponents, again, a similar kind of balance. The thing that's exciting for me is looking at the transaction launch, which is really a look into the future of what we can expect, and we're seeing more and more social infrastructure projects that are not necessarily all hybrid deals, but they could be a combination of hybrid and traditional PPP. In terms of the value, that changes the perspective a little bit, and part of I apologize for the accuracy of this, because there's some projects, particularly the ones that are in pre-procurement transaction launch, we don't really know what the dollar value is, so this really isn't representative of that. But of the ones that have been identified, you can see that that the transport sector still dominates that. We have a pretty good sense of the value of the projects that are in the pipeline in that area, and we're also seeing, again, the telecom one represents the broadband type deals that we know about that are in the market. So in terms of where we're headed, if looking at the transaction launch, I mentioned the fact that we've got 11 social infrastructure deals. We've got 5 in the telecom space. There's actually, the environment one is a bit misleading, because there's actually quite a few water deals that are in the launch phase that are coming to market in the near future. The U.S. Bureau of Reclamation has a half a dozen projects that they were out doing market sounding on, and if President Trump can get his infrastructure plan launched, that would present a significant opportunity for the Bureau to leverage the model to actually get these badly needed projects in place. And I think, unfortunately, the hurricanes that we've seen recently and the damage that they've caused, these are all things that can be partially mitigated through allowing the private sector to work with the Corps of Engineers and the Bureau to actually develop these projects and make them safer for everyone. So in terms of where we're headed, again, transport, the number of deals that we see that are in pre-procurement, transport still leads the way with social infrastructure on its heels, which is great. And as I mentioned, you can see the environment deals there, which are the water deals. And I'll talk a little bit about what I see as the trends going forward. And looking at it more closely by subsector, again, you can see we've got 21 road deals that are in potentially, and a lot of those are right here in California at LA Metro. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But if you see, we got some rail deals, which are LRT type projects. We've got accommodation projects that are in the social infrastructure space. There's the water projects that I mentioned. Street lighting is another trend. We're tracking 5, possibly more actually, street lighting deals. And there's one that's already been closed in Michigan, as you saw on the first slide. And then there's currently Arizona in the market, and we're expecting MassDOT has got a big project, a freeway lighting project as well, that we expect to come to market shortly. So again, it's a pretty robust way for them to shift the risk transfer to the private sector, and the private sector has an opportunity maybe get some uptick on margin versus doing it under a CM type structure. So in California specific opportunities, I guess the big question is, what impact will the games have on infrastructure in California? I mean, I think the population growth itself and the demand for infrastructure is a big enough driver, but when you tack on the games and the potential need there, it could add additional projects to the pipeline. More immediately, these are as I mentioned, the LA Metro projects. They've got 14 projects in their pipeline, some of which they've received the unsolicited proposal, so the ones with the asterisks beside them are unsolicited. And then other potential projects statewide that we're seeing is that there's a streetcar project in LA that's been on the books for some time. They could be will be funded under Measure M. It's a matter of when that money becomes available. There's a few other projects from California DOT that we see, SR 37, the SR 60, and the 156, which 156 has been on the books for a long time. I think it was supposed to be a toll road, and there's a question mark as to whether it's viable because there's so many other free alternatives nearby. And the question is, would Bill pay to use that toll road to get to Santa Cruz quicker? I don't know. Would you, Bill?
Well, given the traffic I had coming down here, yes.
Okay. Well, we should let CDOT know that. And on the social infrastructure side, I'm sure most of you in this room know about the LA Civic Center project. The LA Convention Center, the reason why that's square bracketed is they're currently in direct negotiations with AEG at the moment. But we're hoping that may present an opportunity in the market if things fall apart there. And you can see we've got a few other projects that we've been tracking. The other space that's opening up, and I'm sure Rosie will speak to this, is the airport space, which is exciting and depends on how the FAA views it. And again, the President's infrastructure plan will drive volume and drive deals in that space as well. So that's very exciting. If anyone's been to the Burbank airport, they desperately need a new airport. So there's a real opportunity there for PPP because on its own, it doesn't, the revenue I don't think would drive the economics to develop it as a revenue-based PPP. And then there's a couple of others. This Yountville Veterans Facility is an interesting project in that it's a state-driven project, but it receives funds from the federal government. And if we can get the state on board, and the state officials are touring Merced today, are they not, Dan?
Yesterday.
Oh, yesterday.
Yeah.
Huh? Okay, well, we'll talk about it later. I'm interested to hear how that went. But if we get the state officials on board to support this, that's a very viable project that PPP would be great for. So these are some of the trends that I see in the market in the space. Interestingly enough, the pent-up excitement around the Trump infrastructure plan has actually stalled infrastructure projects because people are standing by waiting for that magic funding source from the $1 trillion of funding that they're expecting. Hopefully, they aren't going to wait too long because I don't know how much success he's going to have. He's obviously really challenged in terms of getting both houses on side to support his plan. So all we've seen so far are things that he can change by executive order. And there aren't many things. He's in theory going to be taking down some red tape that stalls through environmental approvals and things like that. The stalls projects, which would be great. Maybe increase the spending in the tax exempt market. For some of these projects, take the caps off, that sort of thing. Those are things he can do. But the big things that we need to have happen, we need the plan to be released. And so we'll see what he does if he can get it into the budget bill, the tax bill. That might be great. The big one that would open up that market is if they could develop a carve out for federal scoring, that would create a huge market for PPPs. Think about, all of the VA facilities, the Air Force, the Navy, the DOD type projects that are out there in the marketplace if they were being done as PPPs. And they definitely could use help in that area because of the way that they run projects within government. There's typically a lot of overspending that occurs. and they're not particularly well managed, and there's really good examples all over the place, and I won't mention any in case some of you were involved in them. But the federal scoring would present a tremendous opportunity.
Mike, can you just take a minute and explain for those who don't understand what federal scoring and the impact it has on PPPs?
Sure. So the federal scoring rules, so the Office of Management and Budget and the Congressional Budget Office, every bill that goes forward it receives a score by the analysts based on the commitments that future Congresses would have for spending. And so you're committing future governments basically to those obligations. And so naturally a PPP, because the capital up front is spread out over 30 years, they would naturally draw a significant score. So they're from a federal scoring perspective, they're the worst thing that could possibly happen. And interestingly enough, I mean, they issue U.S. Treasuries today, and they fund a $500 million VA hospital today as one check, and then they defer it, or then they destine it to deferred maintenance, and it goes downhill from there. So I think the opportunity there is significant. The other one that we're seeing, obviously success breeds success, and so the UC Merced project was a groundbreaking project for PPPs in the higher education space. And I think, Eric, your conference is a testament to that. You got about 850 people in a couple of weeks in San Diego, 50% of them from the public sector, which is amazing. And so there's a tremendous amount of interest. We've seen UMass, now they've issued a couple of RFPs for PPP projects. The UC system issued a housing RFQ and have qualified some preferred bidders to deal with the housing crisis they have in their campuses. So there's again, success breeds success, and likewise with the Long Beach Civic Center, we're preferred bidder on a similar project, smaller scale, in the city of Napa, and we've got others that are knocking on our door that we are following up with for opportunities like that going forward. So it's the best thing that can happen when we get one of these deals closed, and more importantly, deliver them on time and on budget. And then the other trend that's positive that we're seeing is one of the best practices that we know exists globally is the creation of centers of excellence. First of all, it demonstrates the commitment to the model, and more importantly, it avoids making repeated mistakes. In Canada, we see, they've got Partnerships BC, Infrastructure Ontario, SaskBuilds, a number of agencies that they've set up to do exactly this. So they build that expertise, and from our perspective, when we're evaluating a project, whether we're going to go after it, we're also evaluating the quality of the advisors and the owner's team, because we don't want to spend time practicing and expending, not that we don't like legal fees, but why would we spend all that money educating an owner, and actually it could end up costing us a lot of money, because who knows how they're doing on the approval side. So when we look at a project, we're looking for the quality of the owner's team. So these PPP offices that have been created, for example, the Office of P3 in DC, headed by Seth Miller Gabriel, that's a really good example of how to do it right. They spent the time to develop the policy framework. They've adopted international best practices. They've got a stable of high-quality advisors on board, and they've got the street lighting project as their first one into the market, and they've got a pipeline of 12 that they've identified going forward. So it ticks all the boxes in terms of what we look for. City of Denver, similar kind of thing. They're about to launch their P3 office. The Port Authority in New York and New Jersey, similar kind of thing. And then the West Coast Exchange, which has been around for a number of years, we're starting to see them get active again, which is really exciting. And then the other spaces that we're seeing open up are airports, broadband, the street lighting, and water are making moves in the sector, which are very exciting. And then I mentioned the hybrid deals. And then I guess the last one, is a question mark. Clearly, if we could get the Army Corps, if they would create a carve-out for the Army Corps to do PPPs, there'd be huge opportunity for the private sector to leverage the PPP model to deal with these disaster areas, the recovery zones. So we're looking into that at the moment to see if there is an opportunity, and I know we could make a big difference. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Bill.
Thanks. I'll probably do it from here. Oh, by the way, if any of you want these slides, you can either, Mike, you don't, are your slides going to be available?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Plus, this will all be posted on YouTube in about a month, so you can also access it that way. Okay, just a few more slides, and then we'll get to our panel discussion. But first, one of the obviously the key pending P3 federal legislation areas is the Trump infrastructure plan. Nobody really knows right now, if that's going to happen or when it's going to happen. I guess some might say that he had the first part of his infrastructure plan passed in the last couple of weeks, but all that money's going to Texas and Florida. And we don't know how that's going to impact the P3, as you mentioned, with the Army Corps of Engineers. He has mentioned $1 trillion. The details of that are very unclear. He's talked about tax credits, but those details are very unclear. He did appoint D.J. Gibbons, who's a strong as the head of his infrastructure plan. He's got a strong background. He used to be at Macquarie and other places in P3, so he knows P3. So if they can get something passed, I think he's got at least some of the pieces in place to do it right. The Performance-Based Building Coalition, of which we're all members, is a private nonprofit organization dedicated to P3 building, and it has a private activity bond legislation pending in both houses, HR 960 and Senate Bill 326. It's called the Public Building Renewal Act of 2017. We think it's got a decent chance of passing, but who knows right now? Congress has so many other things they're trying to deal with at the same time. This would make available private activity bonds, which are tax-exempt bonds, similar to a regular municipal bond, let's say, or other public bonds in California. It'd be available on local and state levels throughout the United States. It would create basically $5 billion of tax-exempt private activity bonds to be used for public-private partnerships throughout the U.S. So that would be, I mean, it's a relatively small amount, but it would be a really important first step, and it would allow a lot of these cities. We get contacted by cities and counties all the time interested in doing P3. There are a couple of obstacles. One of the obstacles, the main one, is probably that they don't understand it, how it's going to work. They're trying to get information, which is what Mike was talking about with the centers of excellence. When is P3 available? When is it advisable? What are the laws? What are their procurement laws? Do they allow it or not? Things like that. They're trying to get more information about. The other thing is sometimes we run into the questions about financing. Should we go another route to take advantage of tax-exempt bond financing, which can be a little bit cheaper and just in terms of the interest rate they're paying. But this Public Building Renewal Act, if passed, would help start the trend to take that last question out, because it would allow for them to use private activity bonds, which would be tax exempt. We have this for transportation projects already with the TIFIA program. So this basically takes a TIFIA type program on a federal level and would expand it to building infrastructure.
Bill, it's interesting because Sam Barron, who was here last year, I think she's been here the last couple of years, so she's leading this coalition, and I keep encouraging Sam to look beyond the Public Buildings Renewal Act in terms of what we need to do with the coalition, because this is not a silver bullet. PABs still draw an alternative minimum tax, and that has been the single biggest obstacle as to why the market has not opened up in the U.S., and it's this fixation with tax-exempt debt and the spread differential between even PABs and what the say UC system can borrow at right off the top. So I think a combination of education, benchmark projects like Merced, where they vented in, $650 million or 600 and some odd million dollars into a $1.3 billion project to reduce the weighted average cost of capital. I think education and on that type of thing is really also necessary, and hopefully coalition members are focused on that. And I know we are putting on education seminars across the country for different cities, and we need to continue to do that as well.
So we'll all be following, that legislation and see if it if it is passed, it'll be at least a beginning point for that. Okay,
So,
Justine.
In California, particularly in connection with some water projects that we've seen arising, we often get questions about, well, okay, we as the public side owner want to move forward. We've got some developers we think are interested, but can we actually do it? What's the next step? So there is a fair amount of P3 authorizing statutes in California. The biggest one for fee-producing infrastructure is Government Code 5956, and that code provides a lot of flexibility in how to structure a P3 deal. It allows for design, construction, finance, maintenance of infrastructure assets. So it doesn't require a low bid process as long as there's a competitive negotiation. So that's a real advantage. The limiting factor is, of course, that the infrastructure has to be fee producing. So for an availability payment type project, it's not an option. Another code section that we've been getting a lot of questions about is Government Code 4217. Which is designed for energy conservation contracts, and a number of the water districts have been looking at that. It provides that as long as the financing costs and the design and construction costs of a project will be repaid by revenue from energy efficient sources that wouldn't otherwise have been available, then it can go forward with private partnerships. So that's been getting a lot of attention as well. Those are two that I'll highlight, but there are a number of ways to move forward with P3s. Bill, do you have anything you want to add?
Just on 5956, it only applies to fee-producing new infrastructure, but there's nothing in the case law or in that statute that indicates it has to be net fee producing. In other words, the infrastructure doesn't have to pay for itself. It has to just, so you could have a parking structure that's fee producing, obviously a toll road that's fee producing, but you could, it's unclear how much fees have to be produced. City building departments generate fees. It's not nearly going to pay for itself. That may not be considered a fee producing. City Hall may not be considered a fee producing infrastructure just because it houses its building department and they bring in permit fees and stuff like that. But certainly a lot of other types of water projects are going to generate fees. Health facilities, if we're talking about county, for example, county health facilities generate fees. That would be fee producing infrastructure. So there are a lot of types of infrastructure that can fit into this this enabling statute. And as Justine says on this chart, California has, some of California's cities are charter cities. San Diego's a charter city, for example. And those charter cities aren't governed by the, it has to be a traditional design, bid, build, unless there's a separate enabling statute rule. Charter cities can make their own rules. And so you look at that city, if it's a charter city, you look at that city's charter to determine whether it allows for a public-private partnership type infrastructure. So we have quite a few of the major cities in California are charter cities. And so, just because your P3 idea may not fit into one of these other statutory enabling legislations, that doesn't mean that you can't do P3. If you're in a charter city, you might be able to do P3.
Is that the statute that Los Angeles World Airports used to do their project?
Los Angeles is.
Yeah.
And the one other thing I will say about 5956 is when you really get into the text of that statute, it's really broadly worded. It says it allows procurement of a project for, like I said, design, construction, financing, and maintenance from an entity or a combination of entities. And it has language that says it encourages, the purpose of the statute is to leverage private infrastructure investment to the maximum extent. So there's really a lot of flexibility in terms of how you actually structure the deal. You could, for example, it's from the text of the statute, it suggests you could have a coalition of private entities that then as a public owner you contract with. It doesn't have to go through like a single concessionaire. So that creates opportunities for different deal structures that may be attractive to different public entities.
City of Long Beach, when they did the Long Beach Civic Center project, felt that they probably fit within 59, 56 as a fee producing, because they had a library that was fee producing that was part of the deal. They had 2 parking structures, but just in case, they just went ahead. They were able to go ahead and get their own legislation that enabled them to do P3, and so they got their own, just to be safe. Okay.
So as Mike mentioned, the University of California has launched its student housing initiative. At the beginning of last year, President Janet Napolitano announced that the UC would be adding nearly 14,000 new beds over the next several years. And the university has shortlisted 8 developers. Housing will start at Davis, Santa Cruz, and Riverside. And if we can go to the next slide. Actually, speaking with a representative from Santa Cruz, she indicated that they'll be announcing their developer this week. So I was hoping it would be in time for our presentation today, but it doesn't look like as of this morning it's been announced. So we are expecting that information imminently.
Do you know how they'll structure these deals? Will these be 6320 type structures?
I'm
not sure.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to get into airports in much more detail when Rosie comes up on the panel, but just as an overview, in California we have pending the 2 LAX projects. One's the People Mover, otherwise known as LAMP, which is I think it's $4 billion projected value, and then Conrack, which is the rental car facility, which is just under $1 billion. I know we have some of the shortlisted contractors and developers here. San Diego International Airport Terminal 1 is, I don't know, pre-launch is probably overstating it, as Mike indicated. They're considering it. They're considering it, I think, very seriously going P3, but they haven't decided that. There are other cities in California. San Jose is kind of considering going P3. They need another terminal and some other work too. Of large airports that have recently decided to go P3, we have Denver International Airport, the Great Hall project, which is their main terminal, recently awarded a P3 project for their main terminal to Ferrovial, a Ferrovial-led group, $1.8 billion. We have the Kansas City International Terminal. Actually, after this slide was prepared just about a week ago, this was awarded to Edgemore Real Estate. So that's now been awarded. It's about $1 billion project in Kansas City. And then you want to talk about water?
Yeah, and then we have seen, so in California, we've seen a lot of interest in using P3 procurement method for water treatment facilities. And 3 projects that we're specifically following. One of them is Central Contra Costa Sanitary District has indicated that it's going to do $873 million in capital improvements over the next 10 years. And they've hired a team of P3 advisors to consider whether to go forward with that under a P3 approach. So that's still in the pre-launch planning stages, but it is something that we're keeping an eye on. Cayucos Sanitary District is doing a smaller project, about $25 million water treatment plant renovation and procurement, and they are looking at 5956 as their authority for moving forward with that project.
They're down in San Luis Obispo.
They're down in San Luis Obispo. And that says Santa Clara Valley, but it actually should be Silicon Valley Water District is moving forward with a water treatment plant facility update that is a $600 million project before 2025. and they are also considering a P3 approach. One of the interesting things that we've seen with water districts is, and Bill and I were actually talking about why this is, but there seems to be an interest in doing P3 projects even at smaller dollar values than we sometimes see in the social infrastructure space, where often to attract big P3 developers, the project size has to be 100 million or more. With water districts, that doesn't seem to be the case. And part of it, we think, is that it's such a technical area that there's maybe less market competition. There are fewer firms that are qualified to compete. Also, just because of the technical nature of water treatment plants, it really, you can pencil out the numbers, and I think the criteria that are often set for performance standards are less abstract. So it'll be a certain, a certain amount of effluent or a certain amount of outflow, as opposed to, oh, we want a building that meets a certain aesthetic standard. And because of that, the bidders put less contingency in there, or can profit still with a smaller contingency margin. So Mike, I'd be curious if that's what you think, why it scales down, but those are some of the theories we've floated.
We know from, we partnered with EPCOR on a couple of deals in the US water deals. And we know from their model, they use a spoke and hub kind of model. So if they've already got an operation, say in Texas, and they got a solid base, they'll chase the smaller ones as add-ons. Because the marginal cost to actually do that is not that significant. Where if we're setting up an SPV and having to structure a deal from the ground up every time, we know we need something north of 100 million to make it pencil out properly. So, but that's how they're doing it. So American Water's the same thing. They'll have a big operation in a geographic area, and they can go after these small ones and make them work.
I know there has been some talk in the water industry about seeing if we can get some of these water districts to combine, to consolidate, maybe in some informal fashion, but to consolidate their different facilities and go in together to make them bigger and more appropriate for this.
Actually, just before we leave the water, if you could go back, there was a $950 million water project that I thought it was the Santa Clara Water District that issued it. And they issued it as either a design-build or a PPP.
Yeah. So
that's the one.
Is that the one?
Yeah. But they've split it now since into two phases, I believe. And the first phase is a 600 million, where they're talking about so direct potable reuse, but then they're also talking about mixing direct potable reuse with existing water supplies before putting it through conventional treatment. So that's when I was referencing that number. I think it's for the phase one.
Okay.
Of these three, I think the Central SAN, the Central Contra Costa Sanitary District, it's a very, very good chance that's going to go P3. Okay. I think the Santa Clara Valley or Silicon Valley Water District doesn't. I don't get that feel from that, but I think it'll probably go design-build, but we'll see.
I was looking, there was an update from September of this year, so pretty current online, where it looked like they were still definitely considering like a combination of WIFIA, private funding, or some sort of P3 approach. So I know that that's still under discussion.
One nice thing about the water industry is that there's quite a bit of funding available. So the funding part of it really isn't that much of a problem. It's the other issues we've talked about are big, and there's certainly a huge need, that's for sure. We're seeing a lot of interest from water districts. Our firm happens to represent a lot of water districts across California, so there's a lot of interest.
And one other thing we're seeing from water districts that I think is interesting is sometimes what I've been calling piecemeal P3s, where, for example, a Livenhain Water District took its tanks and membranes and just outsourced the installation and O&M of that particular piece of equipment to a private company. So again, scaling down, it's a much smaller project, but there does seem to be a lot of interest in capturing private sector expertise for some of these more technical components of water treatment plants.
And we wanted to give a shout out. Our friend Eric Iravani's here, and he's one of the key guys on the P3C group that runs really the best conventions and summit group gatherings in the P3 industry in the United States at this point. They've got higher education summit coming up that Mike was talking about in San Diego, October 2nd and 3rd. And they've got, like Mike said, like 800 people already coming, and half of them are from public entities, from the public sector. I mean, and then they've got another one coming up at the end of November in Washington, D.C. for federal procurements that specializes in just federal procurements. And of course, they've got a great one in Dallas every March. Is it March again this year?
Late April.
Late April?
Sorry,
Late February. Just so we can get in, increase our chances of having some sort of a natural disaster. And it's in Dallas. We had snow there a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I remember.
Anyways, it's in Dallas. It's in March, and that's very large. How many people do we get for that now? About
Last year,
3,000.
1,300. Maybe a 5-10% increase.
Yeah, so 1,500 people. And again, almost half of those are from the public sector. They're all interested in doing P3s, learning about it. So these are great networking opportunities. Some people have come up to me during this symposium and asked me, how they what are the good opportunities to network for P3s? This is one of the best opportunities. You have 2 or 3 days. You really get to spend time. There's a lot of breakout sessions and a lot of opportunities to chat with people. I think I was thinking we would break for 5 minutes, but I think we ought to just have Dan Feitelberg and Rosemarie Andolino come up here and just continue with our panel discussion, if you don't mind. We're done with slides. Let me move around here so I can see you all. Okay, Dan. Can you describe for us what the last 5 years in 2 minutes or less, what you've been doing in the last 5 years at UC Merced. I know you just left for KPMG, and I want to hear about that too. But what you were doing at UC Merced, kind of what it was like when you started in terms of P3, and the process that UC Merced used to learn about P3 and make the decision to go forward with the UC Merced 2020 project, which is $1.3 billion or so. Big move.
Yeah, it's a long story. But first of all, thank you for having me join you today. It's a pleasure to be here, and I know many people in this room have been involved in the project in some way, shape, or form. When I joined UC Merced to help the Chancellor and the President's Office and the Board of Regents look at what it would take to build the campus, there was even a larger question, which is in an era of changing dynamics within the higher education industry, and when you're building a new campus, how is the University of California going to react to that new environment, to what physical facilities it would need, and what is the business model for the campus going to look like? And historically, state governments have invested tremendous amounts of public funding in higher education, and that has diminished over time. Tuition rates have increased, and we needed to look at building an overall financial pro forma that would stand the test of time, that would ensure that if we're going to build the campus, it would be maintained over time, and that UC Merced could move away from practices of governments at all levels of government, where we tend to build things and allow deferred maintenance to run their course. And so we really asked the question, if we're going to build it, how do we do it in such a way as we build facilities that will stand the test of time, that will avoid deferred maintenance and ensure that the campus can operate in the way that's intended? And if we can't do that, then we shouldn't move forward. And that started a long programming and planning process around what we would really need, and an evaluation of the financial profile of the project on a life cycle basis. And I think that is what was new. That opened up the opportunity to look at structures of all forms. Of course, you could do design, bid, build within that context. You could do design-build within that context, and you could do various forms of P3 in that context. And ultimately, through significant analysis and work with the Office of the President and the Board of Regents, we chose a structure that enabled us to solve the question of long-term capital maintenance. And that was the problem we were really trying to solve. So we entered into a concession-based design-build, hybrid finance, hybrid operate, maintain contract that enables us to implement the project with a life cycle profile.
So now that the university's gone through this process, how do you see that impacting their future planning? Is P3 do you think, going to be part of the normal course of consideration in their future facility planning?
Well, I think certainly this project is so fundamental to the campus, and the amount of education and understanding and the redesign of the project office that has gone on around it. Clearly, it is viewed as a viable option and is being executed well. The project is going well. So to the extent that additional investment becomes available in the future for Merced to grow, I think it's likely that will be on the table. The other campuses, and you talked about the President's Housing Initiative, many of the structural decisions and real estate decisions and process-based decisions are done at each campus. And so each campus needs to go through its own process of learning what the potential structures are, with assistance from the Office of the President, who has hired its own advisors and has made those resources available to the campuses to plan these projects. But each campus is going to need to go through its own process of education and decision-making about how it will structure its projects for itself.
And now that you're gone from UC, I guess the natural thing for them to educate themselves will be to hire you at KPMG.
That's for them to think about in over a year's time. But in the meantime, this was a big team effort, and it's a $1.3 billion investment by the Board of Regents. It was not taken lightly. There was a tremendous amount of education done by officials at the Merced campus, at the Office of the President, who have a much better understanding of how this structure works. Clearly there's more work to be done as other campuses learn about it, and that's going to take time. There are other viable structures that will be on the table, and they will be considered. So there's a great team there to not only steward the Merced project, but to learn from it. And of course, the market will participate in educating the other campuses as well.
And Bill, if I can, just to circle back to on Mike's question about are they using a 6320 model, my understanding is that due to each campus's different history with P3, they all have sort of different hesitations, and that there isn't going to be a single model adopted across the board, and that each campus is going to come up with its own structure for each P3. Is that your understanding as well?
I agree with that, and I think it does come down to individual decision makers' understanding and comfort level with the structures and how they want to manage the enterprises that exist on their campuses. So there is significant experience within UC for lease-back transactions of different structures and ilks. I think some campuses will look at what I would call the traditional student housing REIT model in the lease-back space. But others may begin to look at hybrid approaches and understand what Merced did and why, and apply different elements of it. So I think it's hard to predict exactly how these structures will come out, but I think the important lesson learned is being able to take a higher level view of the financial profile of each campus, begin to think about the life cycle management and planning from a life cycle standpoint, and then enable some decisions to be made that will drive the best decisions possible for each campus.
Given your experience at UC and what you know about their facilities, and obviously your expertise in P3, what types of facilities at University of California, builds on a regular basis do you think would be most interesting for them in terms of using a P3 model?
Well, I think the common approach from the university's standpoint at present is to think about housing and revenue-producing assets. I think that's the way the market has developed in the United States has been around revenue-producing assets. So I think that's the gut reaction. More and more campuses are saying, what other non-revenue producing assets can we tack on an ancillary basis to housing, where the housing revenue can help pay for those non-revenue producing assets, which gives you a slight ability to scale the project, but you are capacity constrained by the amount of revenue that you're ultimately charging students to live in these facilities. So yeah, I think from my standpoint, I think it's important that the university think more about the life cycle approach to all of its facilities. There's significant deferred maintenance problems within the University of California, as there is across governments, across sectors. And the university needs to begin to think about not only how it's going to rebuild its existing assets that have deferred maintenance, how it's going to maintain that maintenance, and then how it's going to build the new facilities that it needs at different campuses. So I think it will depend, but I think the concept of life cycle planning is catching on.
And what about well, now that you've left UC, is there a kind of a P3 champion or very knowledgeable person there? Maybe it's the UC Merced legacy for that project. Is there somebody that's going to kind of, you think, maybe carry the mantle of P3 for appropriate projects going forward?
Yeah, I think you see it every meeting a project is being brought forth. There are certain members of the board who are asking the question, and in an agnostic way. If a project's being brought in a traditional way, they're asking if you've considered P3, and if a project is being brought on a P3, they're asking about the comparative analysis, which is injecting a bit of discipline into the process. At the Office of the President, the Capital Asset and Real Estate Strategies Group, which is led by Sandra Kim under Nathan Brostrom, who's the Chief Financial Officer for the system, implements policy and process on behalf of the Board of Regents, and hired a cadre of advisors. They ran the process to establish the short list of developers for the housing program. So they are really leading the charge in terms of providing the process and the basis for campuses to follow. But then another layer at the campuses who are led by their own verticals of vice chancellors and real estate managers need to become comfortable with the structures, with how they're going to manage their design and construction groups, their facilities groups, their real estate groups, to be able to develop the offices and the structures to effectively manage these projects. So they are working closely with the Office of the President and working on their own projects to bring them forth. So I think there is momentum from the board to pave the way for the opportunity to look at these structures, and then the campuses will have to bring projects from the bottom up through the process that's being established.
You know, Bill, this is one of the areas where the U.S. has far and exceeded what Canada has done with the PPP space. In Canada, there's a big issue which has prevented DBFMs from occurring, and that's the strong labor movement within the university sector and the concern that universities have around labor. And I think maybe, Dan, if you could explain how you got around that at Merced. I think it was fundamental to this project actually proceeding. Yeah,
and I think that was a very significant focus on the problem that was trying to be solved. That we weren't looking at P3 structures to drive down the costs of labor. We weren't looking at a P3 structure to change the technical specifications of the buildings we would otherwise build. The problem we were trying to solve was the tendency of the university to allow facilities to defer maintenance simply because when assets near the end of their useful life, there's often not the capital budget or the process in place to do the preventative maintenance necessary to effectively maintain those facilities. And that is borne out by our budget processes. I think it's plain to see given some of our deferred maintenance backlogs, and so we focused on that piece of it. So when it came to labor, we worked with our public sector labor unions to ensure that the employees who are providing the janitorial, custodial, day-to-day operations that we do every day and do very well, we would take care of that service, because that was not the problem we were trying to solve. it was the maintenance component in the project. And so we were able to then work with private sector labor in the trades to ensure we put we built in protections for labor into the contract, prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements under state law, and we're able to garner that support to move forward.
How's that project going? 2020 project.
It's great. I was there yesterday. With 3 weeks when I was at Merced on my last day in mid-August. It was just coming out of the ground on the dining facility that's going to be delivered next July, and yesterday they were putting a roof on. So it is moving very rapidly. And I think what's impressive about the speed of this project is the Board of Regents approved the transaction last July. We broke ground in October. So we had a truly, when you talk about the tagline of a shovel-ready project, the process enabled us to be ready to move into construction day one. And so that will enable delivery of 3 buildings by next July, and those remain on track. So yeah, the campus is excited about it. They see the construction every day. It is unprecedented to have the scale and scope of a campus-wide development like this, because universities typically build a building at a time, and so it's palpable on the campus, and it's going very well.
Anybody who's had experience with any college campus construction knows that rule number 1 is get that facility done on time, because they get students moving in, right? The professors need to be in there and so forth. So I imagine that must have been, the timeliness, the efficiency of P3 was probably a big factor in deciding to go that way.
Yes, and I also think it forced the campus to look at its own project governance practices and setting up the manner by which the campus would abide by its obligations under the contract. And we all know that university construction projects often are often burdened by significant change orders because stakeholders are engaged in the process quite late. And so the planning process and the procurement process itself was an opportunity to engage those stakeholders. Stakeholders have continued to be involved. It has generated certain elements of change, but I think far less than has been experienced in the past. And so that governance process has been key to make sure, from the university's perspective, the project remains on track, and that collaboration and partnership with Plenary, Webcor, and JCI's team and has been essential to continuing to move forward.
You know, Bill, with this project, like this is our, I guess we could say it's our 30th project, but of the 30 projects that we've done, I've always had the opinion that once you get over $1 billion, the complexity of the project escalates exponentially. And I think from our perspective, this has probably been one of the best experiences we've had in dealing with the governance on the public sector side, in terms of making timely decisions, the way you guys set it up. It really works well, and I think I speak on behalf of Webcor and JCI in sharing that opinion. And it's gone very, very smoothly, and you guys have got a great governance structure in place. And when you do that, you get a solid partnership to set the table for the next 40 years, right? So it's been great.
Since we're on the topic of timeliness of construction, how's the Long Beach Civic Center project going?
It's going really well. There's a lot of excitement, obviously, in the community, because you can see the redevelopment of that downtown core occurring before your eyes. And we're ahead of schedule at the moment, and think we'll actually deliver the facility early, so we're excited about that, as is the city. That project is an amazing example of why PPPs are so necessary. That we're knocking down a city hall that is 40 years old. We will deliver a city hall that will be 85% new at the end of the 40-year term. So it just speaks to this whole issue of deferred maintenance.
In other words, you're going to keep it new. You're going to start it new, and you're going to keep it new at the end of 40 years.
That's what they're contracting for.
It's not going to take 40 years to finish building.
No. No, we'll be finished long before that. But that's just a classic example That building right now, we're gonna knock it down. It's got an FCI, I think, of about 0.4, which means that it's in rough shape. And if there was a shaker tomorrow, the likelihood of it falling down is pretty high. And so that's why they wanted the new city hall. And it boggles my mind that deferred maintenance can be that bad. And I think that speaks to the importance of the model.
I want to get to airports. Before we get to airports, what's going on? Do you know what's going on with the state university system or community colleges in California in terms of interest in P3?
Yeah, I think everyone's interested. CSU has shown active interest in communicating with UC, which is very typical, just given the structure of higher education in California government. CSU has many of the same issues that UC does, and certainly the community colleges do as well. And I think when you look at public buildings in California, and you look at infrastructure assets of all types in California, they all suffer from the same problem. It is the deferred maintenance issue. So I think there are significant numbers of campuses and public officials who are trying to get their minds and arms around what's possible. As we know, some folks are hoping that P3 generates revenue to allow them to do things they wouldn't otherwise do, and that is a significant constraint that I think will continue to exist, is what is the amount of funding that's available within higher education in California as we continue to grapple with the environment where the support by the state of California and its general fund budget has diminished as a percentage of the budget over time. Tuition has come up, and so what is the true financial capacity given the cost of attendance to continue to fund facilities at the standards by which we've built them in the past? That's fundamental to the question around higher education in California, but I think it's also driving an interest to to understand ways to better manage university infrastructure across the higher education system.
And what I'm hearing from you loud and clear today, that issue of how do we deal with the deferred maintenance issue and the life cycle costs and well-being of new facility development, that issue is being very seriously discussed within UC, within the state system, and within community college districts in California.
Yes. Yeah, and we're seeing it, and Mike mentioned folks from the executive branch of state government who came down to Merced yesterday to look at that same issue across departments and agencies of the state.
Interesting. All right, let's talk airports for a few minutes. Rosie, you're the CEO and president of Manchester Airport Group USA, but you're part of a bigger Manchester group that's the market leader in P3s in UK also. Tell us a little bit about the UK experience that your group has had, and then about United States airports.
Well, the Manchester Airport Group previously was owned and operated by just the Manchester Airport, essentially in the 9 communities around Manchester. They decided then to go out to market, and they wanted to grow and build more assets and operate more facilities. And to do so, they partnered with IFM, which was the pension fund out of Australia. And so the public-private partnership there is the City of Manchester, 9 communities around Manchester, and IFM. And that merger, that partnership allowed them to buy Stansted Airport in London area. As it also gave them the opportunity to come into the US market. In doing so, MAG has continued to deliver increased revenues year over year to their shareholders. Those shareholders get to reinvest that money, upwards of over $136 million or so annually. Each year it's been growing back into their communities. So the win-win there is, in the US, we're not able to take money off airport and put it into the communities essentially. Here, the airport and the money it generates gets to go and support those communities that are part of what will be, or what is, a successful airport, a successful gateway to their country, to the country and to the north of England. And it allows then the community to be engaged, the community to be up to appreciate the airport because of the fact that when you're taking money and improving schools or roadways or building new parks, because of the revenue that the airport generates, then you may have a little bit more of a an understanding about growth, about noise, about traffic. Not that you can't, you can't just put a lot of traffic, a lot of noise. You've got to do the things that are required to reduce those things. But the community accepts it a bit more because they understand there's a benefit directly to them. Lower taxes, better schools, and better infrastructure in and around their community. So that's been a successful blend for us. In the UK, we've seen, again, growth. We've got up to over 55 million passengers now amongst our 4 airports that are, again, it's Manchester, London Stansted, East Midlands, and Bournemouth Airport. We're seeing growth in cargo, growth in low-cost carriers, as well as new entrants from the international scene in addition to that. And again, over $1 billion in revenues that was produced there because of the sensitivity of bringing shareholder value, the need to perform to the customer's satisfaction. A happy customer usually yields more revenue. If they have a good experience coming to the airport, they'll usually spend more money. And again, they'll enjoy doing it. And what we try to do is capture the customer from the moment they book their ticket with parking products, and this is our car parking services product that we have in the UK. We're able to book their parking when they book their ticket, in some cases 52 weeks out. So if somebody who's very price sensitive can book their parking well in advance, somebody who wants to wait till longer can book it later. There's reminders that come up, just like you get when you book a ticket, let's say with any of the carriers, there'll be a reminder periodically. Do you need a rental car? Do you need a hotel? So we do the same thing with our airport, working with distribution partners to kind of get the message out, also obtain a relationship with the customer well in advance of them ever getting to the airport, knowing then what's to come, whether again it's parking, a lounge, our concessions, etc. It also provides another level that people don't think of, but it aids in safety and security. I think most airports today, and especially airport operators, the thing that keeps you up at night is security and safety of your customers and the unknown. And so when you're able to communicate sooner with that customer and share information, good or bad, you're able to have a better handle then of the service levels of your airport.
Airports already involve public and private partnerships, don't they? The airlines, I think, bring in something like 80% of airport revenues on average, something like that, just from the airlines. And the airlines, of course, private. So how do you, can you explain, if and why P3 would be a good fit for certain airport terminals, let's say?
Well, definitely it needs to be considered highly as a delivery method for many terminals and many airports. Will it work with each and every one? Possibly not. But as you said, airports are already doing that on a regular basis today. I think in many cases they forget about all the elements on their airport that may have a private partner in them. If you think about most airports, the FBO, or what I would say is the GA Aviation, the general aviation product, so a signature facility that the private jets operate out of, that is usually a ground lease to a third party who operates it, maintains it, and runs that facility. The airport isn't giving up control. They've got just another business interest on their property generating revenue for them, something that they internally wouldn't have the skills really or the resources to do and manage themselves. And so I think it's a constant reminder to airports about all of the functions at an airport that actually have a third-party investment and interest in it already. I used to manage both airports, O'Hare and Midway, and you think they're very much similar to each other, but in the world of airports, the common phrase is if you've seen one airport, you've seen one airport. So even though the city of Chicago managed O'Hare and Midway, they were managed very differently from each other. We held a lot of the contracts internally at O'Hare, but at Midway we were able to outsource many of them. So our airport terminal operations were outsourced essentially. We had management in place and overseeing the contracts, but the facility was pretty much all outsourced. The maintenance, the custodial, the concessions, again, the FBOs with the hangars, those were all elements of the airport that were outsourced. Now, we maintained the operations of our runway and the snow removal. We had staff on for those elements, and that was our core business, and that was something we needed to stay focused on and deliver. And does it have essentially a revenue return, or can't be really bring in a third party to do. Although we subcontracted out elements of it, like with heavy snows, you'd bring in a third party to bring in ice melters so that you can remove the snow off your premise to get it off of the taxiways and the hold pads, et cetera. And so there are, again, collaboration of third parties and subcontractors that work with airports each and every day. And I think that a P3, and again, an alternative delivery method at airports is needs to be considered, I think is being considered more often. You see what Deborah is doing at LA. You had mentioned about San Diego. When Thela was there, was the previous airport commissioner, she was evaluating it but had not made a decision, felt that that would be what the next airport director needed to own and deliver. Kim Becker from San Jose was now the new airport director, and when we were at the P3 conference, Kim spoke, and talking about the fact that she's just taking a time out for a moment to better understand all of the elements of her facility, all of the moving parts, but is considering a P3.
At San Diego.
Absolutely. But she has to understand all of the elements, the capability of her team, and whether she's delivering the facility herself and managing it, or does she have the right resources to manage a P3 delivery of that. You still have to have some level of oversight, management, and knowledge in-house to still deliver a good transaction. And I think that's where there is a misnomer out there, misinformation, that people feel they have to give up control. And you don't. You actually partner. I think, Dan, you explained that very well in terms of a partnership. There's still oversight. There's still levels of service or quality and expectations. And in some cases, you get a better outcome, in many cases, than if you do it yourself because of the deferred maintenance issue. Because what usually gets cut is your deferred maintenance, because you're trying to plug holes and you only have so much funds or so many resources in-house, that if you actually take a complex airport project, which is usually, when it's an existing airport, it's going to be complex, whether you're impacting an airfield, impacting roadways and entries into that airport, or a terminal expansion. There's some level of operations in that restructuring, in that movement of your people, your customers, and your clients, meaning the airlines. So it's a good transfer of risk. It's a good way to bring in the necessary resources that also can ebb and flow based on the different stages of where you're at in that program. Governments don't respond as have that as nimbly to those types of changes. When you bring people on staff, they're usually there for long periods of time. But programs or projects evolve, and you need different skill sets at different times. And governments really don't support that in terms of the way you hire and maintain your staff. So I think, again, where the more success we have in this area, in this field, and the more examples we can use, whether it's from education or from roadway construction and development or from airports themselves, the more positive experiences that can be highlighted, I think the greater success we will have in bringing more of these projects to market in the airport environment.
The LaGuardia terminal P3 job that's going on in New York, that was really the first big one in the United States. Has that opened up some of these other international airports now, considering P3, do you think?
Yes, I believe so. I believe it's going to do two things. One, when you do these P3s, as we saw, I was part of the Midway privatization in Chicago. Unfortunately, we weren't successful due to market conditions and other issues surrounding that. But what it does is, you have the Puerto Rico, now you have LaGuardia, but the different elements require partnerships with airlines, and all the stakeholders, including the airport, local government, and that education about how to do it, how to benefit from that, are things that will continue to produce greater results, I think, in the future. Airlines now are actually more acceptable. Under the privatization that the federal government has for the privatization of airports, there's only one large airport allowed at each time. Again, that process or that product and that education that has occurred has now, I think, contributed to things like LaGuardia being successful, because the conversations that were had under Midway with Southwest gave Southwest like a benchmark of what their expectation is for airports. And at LaGuardia is a good example. They went in with a, preconceived information and knowledge of how to create a great partnership with third parties. And so that has, again, built on then the other remaining carriers saying, okay, well, how do we get some stability within our cost structure? How do we have better knowledge and understanding about the investment that's going to occur in this facility for the next 20 years? And again, what will our rate structure look like for that? And all of that education has helped, even though the LaGuardia project is very different than, again, what Midway was. It all has created a foundation to, again, provide better knowledge in the marketplace and education and understanding of what could be with these alternative delivery methods.
I want to ask you a couple questions about water. Mike, in the meantime, I want you to be thinking about how performance guarantees, because we've talked about some of the important hallmarks of P3, timeliness of getting these facilities online being one, the life cycle and deferred maintenance issue being another. One of the things I want you to be thinking about, I'm going to ask you in a minute, is how performance guarantees, which are a big issue in P3, how those might help with airports and water projects. But let's talk about water for a second. We talked about that a little bit, but why do you think there's been particular interest among water districts in California, especially, looking at P3? We see, the Silicon Valley Water District taking a very serious look at it, but Cayucas is going, looks like P3, and the Central Contra Costa District is almost for sure going P3. What do you think?
I think that there's a couple reasons. One of them, which we previously discussed, is technical expertise, and I think water treatment plants are really an area where it's possible to leverage private sector expertise, and when there's a vertical integration with your partner, I think that can yield maximum benefits. I also think, like with any P3, water districts are interested in looking at their funding sources and where it's possible to bring in private finance and private loans to further leverage their budgets without hitting their debt capacity limits, then that is an attractive option. So I would say that those are probably the main drivers.
Yeah, it seems like the technology is changing so quickly in the water area, right? With the sustainability and recycling efforts that are so critical. And P3 is a great way to kind of take advantage of the latest in technological advancements.
I think I agree, and I think that there is a lot of interest among different water districts about using direct potable reuse, and as well as what, we're not supposed to call it toilet to tap, but different types of purple water options. And so I think a lot of water districts, there's public interest in starting to have those sorts of products available. And so they're also just taking a closer look at updating their facilities to have expanded production of recycled water.
Okay, performance guarantees.
Yes, so I think generally, just a general statement about PPP is that the value proposition in critical environments increases the more critical the environment, because it is about performance guarantees. So in a typical PPP contract, there's going to be key performance indicators, KPIs that we have to meet. There's going to be response and rectification requirements to issues, and there's going to be quality and service requirements that we're measured on. And if we fail to meet any of those, they typically result in a deduction or an abatement from your monthly payment. And the more critical the item, the more significant the penalties are. And this is real risk transfer. This isn't, in fact, I was talking the other day with someone, and they're saying, well, we should have an item on a conference where we talk about the failures, so people really understand the magnitude of risk transfer. The problem is that I don't really want to get up and talk about, getting abated $3 million in one of our hospitals, right? Even though that in fact happened. And so that it is real risk transfer. So in an airport environment, think about this. When you're moving planes in and out of gates and you affect on-time performance, it has knock-on revenue impacts for the airport. I had a misconnection in Chicago a couple weeks ago that was a disaster. And the airport has to reallocate customers, and it's a very costly exercise. So if you had a PPP contract and I was responsible for the gate performance, and we had an urgent situation and I didn't respond and rectify within a prescribed period of time, I'm going to be subject to significant abatements. And we have that. Like I said, the more critical the environment, the bigger we've got a data center that we operate for the government of Ontario. It's a level 4, tier 4 certified for operations and construction. And if one side of the redundant system goes down for a prescribed period, our abatements within a period start at $250,000 and they can go up to $1 million per session. That's a lot of money. So needless to say, what we do to mitigate that is we do predictive and preventative maintenance. Not just preventative maintenance, but we do predictive maintenance. So we do a monthly heat scan of the data floor to look for transformers that are out of range, and we swap them out before they fail. We've got vibration sensors on the motors that pick up, again, out of range vibration that's an indicator that it could fail, and we swap them out and rebuild them. So that's the type of thing that we do. And in fact, that is why it is actually cheaper to do the maintenance that way than it is to wait for that motor to fail, because when it fails, it has a downstream cost implication. So the performance elements drive a behavior which in turn aligns the interests with a critical environment like an airport.
Well, and the performance guarantees do two things that I think actually have the effect of increasing the control of the government and policymakers in managing their infrastructure. One is it flips the warranty structure, because in our traditional delivery mechanisms, and even with design-build, the government entity will pay for 100% of the facility when construction is complete, and then rely and have to claim against warranties if something goes wrong. And in the structure of a PPP, as Mike's describes, it flips the warranty on its head. So if the availability is not being provided per the KPIs, the government doesn't pay for the building and forces the developer to claim against it. Complete reversal of control. And so when you establish those KPIs, you then empower policymakers and users to establish policies about how these facilities should function. So whether it's a Southwest or the airport determining a performance standard, or a university relying on its faculty for the acoustical standards and air quality control standards of a laboratory, we're setting policies rather than setting the technical specifications, and that's what's enabling us to focus on the functionality of the facilities that ties directly into the public service we're trying to provide. And that's a real enabler that P3 is giving, and control that P3 is giving to government officials that haven't been there in the past.
I think to build on that not getting too technical piece of it allows for the innovation of the third party to come in and figure out the best way to deliver that KPI, right? You can't get too prescribed, otherwise you're taking away innovation and taking away that flexibility to do that. But I think that message still needs to resonate with, again, cities and airports about they still maintain that level of control and oversight. Because I think, again, the first thing they think of a 3P is that they've relinquished control, and they don't. They're still the landlord. They're still managing that contract. They're managing the KPIs, working collaboratively. I think that it forces more, when you have essentially more parties at the table, the need to clearly communicate everybody's interests in more detail. I think sometimes it otherwise is, I'm the landlord, you're the tenant, I will tell you what you need to deliver. And to some areas, there's not an alignment of those interests, versus when there's a third party in there, you really need to be clear on people's responsibilities and deliveries, and clearly identify where that element falls and who's taking responsibility and how it's going to be delivered. So it almost gives you more control, because it really forces the thought process on that, versus at the end of the day, well, I have the stick to remedy that, which is not the end goal. The end goal is to not have to use the stick. The end goal is to motivate via the incentives that are there.
One of the buzzwords we hear, not just in the construction industry, but in every industry right now, is that products and construction buildings are becoming smart. And we haven't seen it enough, so much yet, but it's coming very quickly. They talk about our appliances are all going to become smart. Their sensors are starting to go in everything, and the sense to give feedback. Sensors are going to be going into our buildings in all sorts of systems, and I imagine that kind of plays right into the strengths of a triple P.
Well, it's already here, actually. Yeah. I mean, I think we're starting to see it more in consumer goods, hard goods like fridges and that kind of stuff. But it's already here. I mean, we've done a couple digital hospitals now in Ontario, and the level of sophistication in the networks and the sensors and the communication between systems, I think technology integration right now is the biggest risk we face on these more complex PPPs. And if we had lots of time, I could tell you some horror stories. But if you think about it, we've got in the Humber River Hospital in Ontario, we've got robots that deliver food to the floors. We've got they take laundry and linen to the appropriate places, clean and dirty. When the surgeon is closing, like they're suturing up their patient, the OR nurse hits the computer and automatically triggers housekeeping to show up to turn that OR over in a quicker way. And then that, when we've got the schedule of surgeries that are already planned, the mechanical and electrical systems bring on the appropriate air exchanges and that sort of thing to prepare for the day, that sort of thing. So that integration of technology is already there, and I mean, the contractors in the room have a better sense of it than me, but I think it's one of the biggest risks that we face in constructing these projects.
And I suppose you think as P3 developers, and when you get your whole team together, including your operations and maintenance team, service provider team, that you're better able to at least take advantage of the latest in those types of technologies.
Yes, but you got to think about it. Like we're contracting now for up to 40 years into the future. We have this contract for the Communications Security Establishment Canada, which is like the NSA in the States, and we contracted for 30 years, and we're providing their networks, their end-use devices, so the handhelds, the laptops, the desktops, for the next 30 years. We don't even know what the handheld's going to look like, or if there will be handhelds.
It'll probably be in your hand.
It could be a 3D hologram, that you talk to. But we developed a mechanism to allow us to do that. So to a certain extent, our partners rely on innovation and technology to be able to do that into the future. So the question is, how much do they discount their price to allow for that technology to solve the problem going forward? And that's really what market competition drives. So the Johnson Controls and Honeywells and those folks, that's what they look at when they're looking at a contract. They're saying, how much will technology help me into the future, and how should I price that?
I want to ask you about street lighting. If anybody has, we're going to wrap up here in a minute, so if anybody has any questions, Janet in the back will have a microphone, and just raise your hand. But in the meantime, let's talk about, since we're talking about smart building, let's talk about street lighting. You mentioned in your opening remarks that there was a particular interest recently in kind of smart street lighting projects.
Yeah, so we're tracking quite a few actually projects, and some of them are simply swapping out the old technology for new LED technology. But if you think about the potential, when you're actually doing the conversion of creating a smart network that you could use to create an entire, light up a whole area as a Wi-Fi hotspot. There's opportunities like that. And so some of the procurements that we're seeing are actually looking for that type of innovation. And just like the hybrid real estate deals, they're looking for it to offset the initial capital cost of the actual conversion. In other cases, we're seeing they're looking for energy guarantees. So they want a guarantee on reduction of consumption, or they want us to take that risk in order to pay back the cost of the retrofit. So we're seeing a variety but I think the opportunity for innovation there to think about what you could actually do when you have that network of 5,000 or 10,000 streetlights that you're actually responsible for retrofitting and maintaining. And I think that's where the secret will be to winning and to competing effectively, is to develop that innovation and drive a cost-effective solution for the cities and DOTs that are procuring them.
I know roadways, we're getting to the point where you can almost, as we get more electric vehicles, they can embed in our roads electric recharging facilities. So you don't even have, you charge as you drive along.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of interesting things like that. Any questions? If not, I want to thank you guys very much. And thank you audience.